There is a specific kind of invisibility reserved for people who pour water for the ultra-rich. To the billionaires and power brokers carving up empires over truffles and aged Bordeaux, a waitress is not a person. She is a piece of moving furniture. But furniture has ears. When 26-year-old Chloe Higgins leaned in to pour a 1996 Chateau Margaux, she didn't just overhear the mundane details of a corporate merger. She heard a death sentence masked as a boardroom strategy. One single, whispered sentence shattered her mundane reality, plunging her into a deadly game of corporate espionage, blackmail and survival, where the currency was human life and the players took no prisoners. The dining room of L'Orchidée was a masterclass in calculated discretion. Located in a nondescript subterranean vault beneath Manhattan's financial district, the restaurant boasted no exterior signage. Its entrance was an unmarked brass door in an alleyway, guarded by men whose tailored suits failed to hide the bulk of their shoulder holsters. Inside, the aesthetic was dark and oppressive. Heavy mahogany panels, sound-dampening velvet drapes the color of dried blood, and lighting so dim it felt like dining in a sepulchre. It was the preferred feeding ground for men who moved markets with a phone call, a sanctuary where NDAs were implied by the mere act of sitting down. Chloe Higgins was 26, drowning in medical debt, and practically invisible. To the patrons of L'Orchidée, Chloe was nothing more than a pair of white-gloved hands delivering plates of seared foie gras and crystal glasses of scotch. She had perfected the art of the ghost walk, moving silently across the thick Persian rugs, speaking only when spoken to, her face a mask of polite deference. She needed this job. The tips from a single Tuesday night were often enough to cover a month's rent in her cramped apartment in Queens. More importantly, they covered the mounting out-of-pocket costs for her mother, Evelyn, who was rapidly losing her battle with a rare, aggressive form of early-onset dementia. It was a rainy Thursday night when the hostess, a steely-eyed Frenchwoman named Margot, pulled Chloe aside. "Booth 4, Margot murmured, her voice barely rising above the low hum of the jazz trio playing in the corner. "Richard Hawthorne and a guest. You are on them exclusively. Do not linger. Do not make eye contact unless addressed. They requested the utmost privacy." Chloe nodded, wiping her damp palms on her black apron. Everyone in the hospitality industry knew Richard Hawthorne. He was the founder of Hawthorne Capital, a private equity firm that specialized in hostile takeovers. He was known as a corporate butcher, a man who bought failing companies, stripped them of their assets, fired thousands of workers, and walked away with billions. He was ruthlessly efficient, notoriously paranoid, and completely devoid of empathy. When Chloe approached Booth 4, nestled deep in the darkest corner of the restaurant, behind a partial screen of frosted glass, she saw Hawthorne immediately. He was in his mid-50s, with silver hair clipped with military precision and eyes like chips of flint. Across from him sat a younger man, sweating profusely despite the cool, climate-controlled air. He wore a Brioni suit that looked a size too big, constantly adjusting his tie as if it were a noose. Chloe stepped forward, her tray balanced perfectly. "Good evening, gentlemen. May I start you with sparkling or still water?" Hawthorne didn't even look at her. "Still. And bring the bottle of the 96 Margaux. Decant it immediately." "Right away, sir," Chloe murmured, backing away smoothly. As she retreated, she heard the younger man speak. His voice was a strained, frantic whisper. "Richard, you don't understand the timeline. The FDA inspectors are moving up their audit. If they look at the raw data from the Phase 3 trials—" "Calm down, Damien." Hawthorne's voice was a low, soothing baritone that somehow managed to sound entirely menacing. "Panic is a poor negotiating tactic." Chloe recognized the name from the reservation list. Damien Cross. He was the CEO of Ethelgard Pharmaceuticals, a mid-sized biotech firm that had recently been making headlines in the Wall Street Journal. Ethelgard was on the verge of releasing a supposedly revolutionary neuroregenerative drug called amnionix, pitched as a miracle cure for degenerative brain diseases. The stock was soaring in anticipation of FDA approval. Hawthorne Capital had recently acquired a massive 51% stake in the company. At the sommelier station, Chloe carefully uncorked the dark green bottle, her mind wandering briefly to her mother. Evelyn was currently enrolled in a clinical trial. It was the only way Chloe could afford cutting-edge treatment. The doctors had been optimistic at first, but lately, Evelyn's condition had sharply declined. She suffered from violent nosebleeds, terrifying hallucinations, and sudden drops in blood pressure. The doctors dismissed these as normal progression of the disease, but Chloe's gut told her something was terribly wrong. She placed the decanter on a silver tray and navigated back to booth 4. As she slipped behind the frosted glass screen, she practically melted into the shadows of the alcove, pouring the dark red wine into the crystal balloons with practiced silence. The two men had leaned in close, their heads almost touching over the flickering candlelight. They were entirely oblivious to her presence. To them, she was simply part of the room's architecture. "I can't authorize the public release, Richard," Damien Cross hissed, his hands trembling as he reached for his water glass. The secondary trials were a disaster. The neural pathways didn't just fail to regenerate, they collapsed. The drug becomes highly toxic to the liver and pulmonary systems after 6 weeks of sustained use. Chloe stopped breathing. She stood perfectly still, the heavy crystal decanter suspended an inch above Hawthorne's glass. "We are talking about a multi-billion-dollar IPO, Damien," Hawthorne replied, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his wine. "We have the media in our pocket. We have the senators lobbied. I have invested $400 million of my clients' money into Ethelgard. We are not halting the rollout because of a minor statistical anomaly." "It is not a statistical anomaly." Damien's voice cracked, bordering on hysterical. "People are dying, Richard." The air in the alcove seemed to thicken, pressing against Chloe's chest like a physical weight. She forced her hand to remain steady, completing the pour into Hawthorne's glass without spilling a single drop, though her pulse hammered violently against her eardrums. She took a half step back, pressing her spine against the velvet wall, trapped in the narrow space between the table and the heavy drapes. If she moved now, the rustle of her uniform might draw their attention. She had to wait for a natural pause. Hawthorne set his wine glass down with a soft, definitive clink. The sound was like a gunshot in the tense silence. "Lower your voice," Hawthorne commanded, the dangerous softness returning to his tone. He leaned forward, his flinty eyes locking onto Damien's panicked face. "You came to me because you were bankrupt. You begged for a lifeline. I gave it to you. Amnionix goes to market next month as scheduled." Damien wiped a bead of sweat from his temple. "The FDA review board demands the unredacted files. They've flagged the sudden drop in our trial participant numbers. If they cross-reference the obituaries with our clinical roster—" "They won't," Hawthorne interrupted smoothly. "Sylvia has already taken care of the data center in New Jersey. A tragic electrical fire, total server loss. We are relying entirely on the backed-up, cleaned data stored in Zurich." Chloe's mind spun. Clinical roster. Amnionix. Dropping numbers. Her mother was in a trial for a drug called amnionix. Chloe had signed the consent forms herself, sitting in a sterile white room at a clinic in Brooklyn. The lead doctor had promised it was safe, a beacon of hope for dementia patients. But her mother had been vomiting black bile for 3 days. Her liver enzymes were off the charts during their last ER visit. Damien looked horrified. "You burned down the server farm? Richard, that's arson. That's federal conspiracy. And the physical files. The patients who are still active in the Phase 3 trial." Hawthorne cut his steak with surgical precision, placing a small piece in his mouth and chewing slowly before he spoke. When he did, he delivered the sentence that would alter the trajectory of Chloe Higgins's life forever. "By the time the FDA realizes the trial killed those 12 patients, we'll have cashed out our shares, and the autopsy reports will be ash." The words hung in the air, cold, clinical, and steeped in blood. Chloe felt the blood drain from her face. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel. 12 patients. Her mother wasn't just sick, she was being poisoned for profit. She was collateral damage on a billionaire's balance sheet. "And the remaining active participants?" Damien whispered, his spirit completely broken. "There are still 48 people taking the dosages." "Let them take it," Hawthorne said dismissively. "We need the appearance of an ongoing successful trial until the IPO clears on the 15th. After the bell rings and the stock peaks, we dump our shares. If the drug is recalled a week later, it's not our problem. We blame the chief medical officer for falsifying the early data. We fire him, and we walk away billionaires." Chloe's grip on the heavy crystal decanter tightened so fiercely her knuckles turned bone white. A primal, screaming rage ignited in her chest. She wanted to smash the bottle over Hawthorne's perfectly groomed head. She wanted to scream until the whole restaurant heard her. But a colder, sharper instinct took over. Survival. If she reacted now, she was just a hysterical waitress. Hawthorne had private security waiting outside. He had lawyers who could bury her. He could make her disappear, just like the data center in New Jersey. She took a slow, silent breath through her nose, locking her emotions away behind an iron door in her mind. She plastered on her blank, deferential mask and stepped out of the shadows. "Will there be anything else for you, gentlemen?" Her voice was a miracle of composure, betraying none of the earthquake tearing through her soul. Hawthorne didn't even glance up. He waved a dismissive hand. "No. Bring the check in 20 minutes." Chloe bowed her head and walked away. Every step back to the kitchen felt like wading through deep water. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking silverware, the muted laughter, the jazz music, sounded warped and distorted. She pushed through the swinging doors into the chaotic heat of the kitchen and practically collapsed against the stainless steel prep counter, dropping the decanter with a loud clatter. "Hey, watch the crystal, Higgins!" barked the sous chef, pausing his frantic chopping. Chloe ignored him. She pressed her hands to her face, trying to stop the room from spinning. Her mother was taking her pill tonight. Right now, Evelyn was likely sitting in her armchair, swallowing the very poison that was liquefying her internal organs, trusting the doctors, trusting Chloe. She checked her watch. 10:45 p.m. Her shift ended at midnight. She couldn't just call the police. She had zero proof. A waitress overheard something. Wouldn't warrant an investigation into one of the most powerful men on Wall Street, especially when the evidence had conveniently burned down. She needed hard, undeniable proof. She needed the real files, and she knew exactly where they might be. The subway ride back to Queens was an agonizing blur. Chloe sat rigid on the plastic seat, her uniform hidden beneath a worn trench coat, staring blankly at the dark tunnel walls rushing past the window. Hawthorne's words echoed in her skull on a relentless loop. The autopsy reports will be ash. When she finally unlocked the door to her apartment, the heavy smell of illness and antiseptic hit her like a physical blow. The apartment was small, cramped with medical equipment. A home health aide, an older woman named Maria, whom Chloe paid under the table, was dozing on the sofa. "Maria," Chloe whispered, shaking the woman's shoulder gently. Maria jumped, rubbing her eyes. "Oh, Chloe, you're home late. Your mother. It was a bad night. The pain in her abdomen. She was crying out. I tried to call the trial hotline, but it went straight to a busy signal." Chloe's heart twisted. She walked into the tiny bedroom. Evelyn lay in the hospital bed, looking incredibly frail, her skin possessing a terrifying jaundiced yellow hue. Her breathing was shallow and wet. On the bedside table sat a small, unmarked amber pill bottle. The label simply read, "Ethelgard Trial, Protocol 7, Patient 401. Chloe grabbed the bottle, her hands shaking violently. She marched into the bathroom, dumped the remaining white capsules into the toilet, and flushed them away. She watched them swirl into the drain, a small, defiant act against a multi-billion-dollar machine. But stopping the medication wasn't enough. The damage was already done. Evelyn was dying, and her murderers were planning to ring the bell at the New York Stock Exchange in 3 weeks. "I'm going to fix this, Mom," Chloe whispered, kissing Evelyn's feverish forehead. "I promise." The next morning, Chloe didn't sleep. She sat at her small kitchen table, drinking black coffee, surrounded by printouts from a cheap public library printer. She had spent hours researching Ethelgard Pharmaceuticals, Damien Cross, and Hawthorne Capital. She looked for the missing link. Hawthorne had mentioned a woman. Sylvia has already taken care of the data center. A quick search of Hawthorne Capital's executive roster revealed a Sylvia Croft, listed innocuously as Director of Risk Management. A deeper dive into obscure corporate forums and legal filings painted a different picture. Sylvia Croft was an ex-intelligence officer, a corporate fixer who handled Hawthorne's dirty work: intimidation, blackmail, suppressing whistleblowers. That was Sylvia's real job. If Hawthorne was moving forward with the IPO despite the disaster, he wouldn't leave loose ends. He wouldn't trust Damien Cross. Damien was a liability, nervous, prone to panic, burdened by a conscience. Hawthorne would have taken possession of whatever physical proof remained to ensure Damien couldn't confess to the authorities. Chloe remembered Damien's leather briefcase. He had clutched it to his chest when he arrived at L'Orchidée, refusing to check it with the hostess. He had kept it by his feet the entire dinner. But when they left, after a heated, whispered argument near the exit, Damien had stormed out, empty-handed. Hawthorne's driver had carried the briefcase out. Hawthorne had a standing reservation at L'Orchidée every Tuesday for a working lunch in the private sovereign room upstairs. It was a space reserved for the absolute elite, equipped with its own private coat closet and secure Wi-Fi. Chloe had 4 days until Tuesday. She went to an electronics store in Manhattan, paying cash for a high-definition micro-recording pen and a cheap burner phone. She knew nothing about espionage, but she knew the layout of L'Orchidée better than anyone. She knew the blind spots of the security cameras. She knew that the lock on the sovereign room's coat closet was temperamental and could be slipped with a stiff piece of plastic. When Tuesday arrived, Chloe volunteered to cover the upstairs shift. Margot, the hostess, looked surprised but agreed, citing a shortage of staff due to the flu season. At 1 p.m., Richard Hawthorne arrived. He was not with Damien Cross today. He was flanked by 2 massive men in dark suits and a striking, severe-looking woman with sharp cheekbones and cold, calculating eyes. Sylvia Croft. Hawthorne handed his cashmere overcoat to Chloe. Sylvia Croft handed her a sleek, black leather satchel. It wasn't Damien's briefcase, but it was heavy, secured with a biometric thumb lock. "Handle it carefully," Sylvia said, her voice like grinding glass. She didn't look at Chloe's face, only at her hands. "Of course, Mom," Chloe said. taking the satchel. Chloe walked to the private coat closet inside the sovereign room suite. She hung up the coats and placed the satchel on the shelf. Her hands were sweating. The microcamera pen was clipped to her apron. She couldn't open a biometric lock, but she didn't need to. She just needed to see what was inside the pockets of Hawthorne's coat. Arrogant men often left crucial things in their pockets, believing they were untouchable. She slipped her gloved hand into the deep pockets of Hawthorne's cashmere coat. Empty. She checked the inner breast pocket. Her fingers brushed against stiff paper. She pulled it out. It was a folded itinerary and a secure access keycard for a private terminal at Teterboro Airport, stamped with the date of the Ethelgard YPO. Hawthorne was planning to leave the country the moment the bell rang, but behind the keycard was a folded, crumpled sheet of paper. It looked like a printed email, heavily redacted with a black marker. Chloe quickly unclipped the pen from her apron, activating the camera, and snapped several clear photos of the document. The visible text read, "Cross is unstable. If he attempts to contact the FDA, enact contingency protocol. The remaining Zurich files are secured on the encrypted drive. I have the drive." S. C. Sylvia had the drive, the physical backup of the real trial data, and she was sitting 20 feet away. Suddenly, the heavy oak door of the closet swung open. Chloe froze, the paper still in her hand. Standing in the doorway was Sylvia Croft. Her eyes darted from the black satchel on the shelf to Chloe's frozen posture, immediately registering the unnatural stillness. The polite invisibility of the waitress had vanished, replaced by the cornered tension of prey. "What exactly?" Sylvia said, stepping into the small, confined space of the closet and letting the door click shut behind her. "Do you think you are doing?" "What exactly?" Sylvia Croft said, stepping into the small, confined space of the sovereign room's coat closet and letting the heavy oak door click shut behind her. "Do you think you are doing?" The air in the closet instantly grew 10 degrees colder. Sylvia did not raise her voice, but the quiet, deadly frequency of her tone was far more terrifying than a shout. She stood blocking the only exit, her perfectly tailored charcoal suit acting like armor. Chloe's heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. The crumpled, redacted email burned against the palm of her hand. She had a fraction of a second to decide whether to fight, flee, or lie. A waitress fighting a corporate intelligence operative was a surefire way to end up dead in the East River. Chloe chose the only weapon she had, her invisibility. She let the raw, genuine terror she was feeling flood her face, letting her hands shake violently. I'm so sorry, ma'am," Chloe stammered, her voice cracking perfectly. She let the paper flutter from her trembling fingers to the carpeted floor. The coat slipped off the hanger. When I grabbed it, that paper fell out of the pocket. I was just trying to put it back. Sylvia's cold eyes flicked down to the paper on the floor, then back to Chloe's pale face. She didn't move an inch. She didn't look convinced, nor did she look entirely skeptical. She looked like a predator, assessing the caloric value of a wounded rabbit. "Pick it up," Sylvia commanded. Chloe bent down, her knees knocking together. As she did, she subtly pressed the tiny button on the top of the microcamera pen clipped to her apron, shutting it off. She retrieved the paper and held it out, her eyes downcast, the perfect picture of a subordinate who knew she had overstepped. Sylvia snatched the paper from her hand. She unfolded it, smoothed it out, and slid it back into Hawthorne's coat pocket. Then she stepped closer, invading Chloe's personal space. The scent of expensive, sharp bergamot perfume filled the cramped closet. "What is your name?" Sylvia asked softly. "Chloe, ma'am." "Listen to me very carefully, Chloe," Sylvia murmured, her gaze boring into the waitress. "Men like Richard Hawthorne run the world. because they do not tolerate leaks, errors, or nosy staff. I have an account with Kroll Inc. Do you know what that is? It is a global corporate investigation firm. With one phone call, I can pull your entire life apart. I can find your debts, your family, your medical records, and your internet search history. If I find out you read a single word on that paper, you will find yourself unemployable, unhoused, and utterly destroyed. Do we understand each other? Yes, ma'am, Chloe whispered, staring at Sylvia's polished shoes. I didn't read anything, I swear. I just pick up coats. Sylvia stared at her for a long, agonizing 10 seconds. Finally, she stepped back and opened the closet door. Get out. Tell Margot you are unwell and go home. If I ever see your face in this establishment again, Kroll will be the least of your worries. Chloe practically stumbled out of the closet, keeping her head bowed. She didn't wait to be formally fired by Margot. She bypassed the hostess stand entirely, pushing through the swinging kitchen doors, grabbing her trench coat from the staff locker room, and practically running out into the rain-slicked alley behind the restaurant. It wasn't until she was 3 blocks away, blending into the anonymous crowds of the financial district, that she finally stopped and leaned against a damp brick wall. She reached into her apron, her fingers trembling as she unclipped the cheap plastic pen. She had been fired. She had lost her only source of income. But as she gripped the tiny recording device, a fierce, protective fire burned through her panic. She had the proof. Sylvia Croft had just confirmed how valuable that piece of paper was. Now, Chloe just had to find the weakest link in Hawthorne's armor, and she knew exactly who that was. Damien Cross did not look like the CEO of a billion-dollar biotech firm. Sitting in the dimly lit corner of the Dead Rabbit, an upscale tavern in Lower Manhattan, he looked like a man waiting for his own execution. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Thursday, 3 days after Chloe had been fired. It had taken her that long to track his movements, relying on public appearances and a desperate, hyper-focused stakeout outside Ethelgard's corporate headquarters. Chloe slid into the leather booth across from him. She wasn't wearing her white-gloved uniform anymore. She wore a dark hoodie and a plain jacket, looking entirely unremarkable. Damien blinked at her, his eyes glassy from the 3 empty Scotch glasses lined up in front of him. Excuse me. This booth is private. Booth 4. Lorkide, Chloe said quietly, leaning forward so her voice wouldn't carry over the hum of the bar. You drank sparkling water. Richard Hawthorne drank a 96 Margot. You argued about the FDA timeline, and you talked about the 12 dead trial patients. The remaining color drained from Damien's face. He looked like he was going to be sick. His hands instinctively moved to cover the expensive watch on his wrist, a nervous tick. Who are you? He choked out, looking frantically around the bar to see if they were being watched. Are you SEC? Did the Department of Justice send you? I poured your water, Chloe said flatly. I'm the waitress you and Hawthorne thought was deaf and blind. And my mother is patient 401 in your Phase 3 trial. Damien stopped breathing. The utter shock in his eyes morphed slowly into a profound, crushing guilt. He slumped back against the leather booth, burying his face in his hands. Oh, God, he whispered. I tried to stop him. I swear to you, I tried to halt the rollout. But Hawthorne, he owns everything. He owns the board, he owns the debt, he owns the IP. He doesn't own the truth, Chloe pressed, keeping her voice steely. She couldn't afford to feel sorry for this man. I know about the Zurich files. I know Sylvia Croft has the encrypted drive with the real medical data. The data that proves amnionics is lethal. Damien looked up, his eyes bloodshot. If you know about Sylvia, you know you're already dead if you pursue this. Hawthorne uses the law firm Skadden, ARPS, to tie up whistleblowers in litigation until they go bankrupt, and he uses Sylvia to make sure they never make it to court. You have no idea what you're dealing with. I'm dealing with my mother dying, Chloe snapped, the ice in her voice cracking just enough to show the terrifying heat beneath. And I have a photograph of the internal communications proving a cover-up. I'm going to the FBI, Damien. But an anonymous tip from a fired waitress isn't enough to raid Hawthorne Capital. I need a witness. I need you. Damien let out a hollow, bitter laugh. Me? Testify against Richard Hawthorne? He'd have me killed before I reached the courthouse steps. He's going to ruin you anyway, Chloe urged, leaning closer. Hawthorne said it himself. Once the stock peaks, he dumps his shares. When the drug is recalled, he's going to frame you for falsifying the early data. You are the fall guy, Damien. Your only way out is to blow the whistle first. Damien stared at his empty glass for a long time. The ambient noise of the bar seemed to fade away. He looked at Chloe, really looking at her for the first time, seeing not a piece of furniture, but a desperate daughter willing to burn down Wall Street to save her mother. Sylvia keeps the drive on her person at all times, Damien whispered, his voice trembling. It's a titanium thumb drive, biometric lock. But I know the master decryption key. I built the Ethelgard software architecture before we went public. If you can get that drive, the key is the serial number of the very first patent we filed. I have the patent documents in my home safe. Get them, Chloe said. We go to the Southern District Attorney tomorrow. Damien nodded slowly, swallowing hard. Okay. Meet me tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Bethesda Terrace in Central Park. It's public, lots of tourists. I'll bring the patent documents and a sworn affidavit. We go to the DA together. Chloe felt a massive surge of relief. Thank you, Damien. You're doing the right thing. I'm trying to, he murmured, looking haunted. Chloe left the bar first, taking a circuitous route to the subway to ensure she wasn't followed. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. They had a plan. They had the decryption key. They were going to stop Hawthorne. The next morning, Chloe arrived at Bethesda Terrace at 8:30 a.m. She stood near the fountain, watching the early morning joggers and tourists pass by. The air was crisp and cold. She held a cheap coffee cup in her freezing hands, her eyes scanning the pathways for Damien's nervous, stumbling figure. 9 a.m. came and went. By 9:30 a.m., Chloe's stomach began to knot with dread. She pulled out her burner phone and checked the news, a terrible premonition washing over her. There, in glaring black letters across the digital front page of the local news outlet, was the headline, Ethelgard, Pharmaceuticals, C. E.O. Damien Cross found dead in Tribeca penthouse. Police investigating apparent suicide. Chloe dropped the coffee cup. It splattered across the cobblestones, a dark stain spreading over the grey stone. Damien was dead. The whistleblower was silenced, and Chloe Higgins was now the only person left alive who knew the truth. The headline blurred before Chloe's eyes. Damien Cross was dead. The official narrative was already spinning out across the financial networks, a tragic suicide brought on by the immense pressure of the upcoming IPO. But Chloe knew the terrifying truth. Damien hadn't jumped from his Tribeca balcony. He had been pushed by a machine that crushed anything standing in the way of its profit margins. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her chest. She was completely alone. She had no job, her mother was dying, and the only man who could corroborate her story was currently lying in the city morgue. The encrypted drive was still in Sylvia Croft's possession, and the Ethelgard Wine P.O. was scheduled to launch in exactly 5 days. Chloe spent the next 48 hours in a state of hyper-vigilant paranoia. Every shadow in her Queen's apartment looked like a Kroll investigator. Every click on her phone line sounded like a wiretap. She sat by Evelyn's bedside, watching her mother's chest rise and fall in shallow, ragged breaths. Taking her off amnionix had stopped the violent nosebleeds, but the damage to her liver was irreversible. The doctors had gently suggested moving her to hospice care. I can't let them win, Chloe thought, squeezing her mother's frail hand. I can't let Hawthorne ring that bell. If she couldn't rely on Damien, she had to get the drive herself. It was a suicide mission, but the alternative was watching Hawthorne walk away with billions while hundreds of families buried their loved ones. Chloe knew from her time at Lorchidee that Hawthorne Capital was hosting a massive, exclusive pre-IPO gala the night before the bell ringing. The venue was the Grand Ballroom at the Plaza Hotel. It was a logistical fortress, crawling with private security and New York's elite. Chloe couldn't walk in the front door, and she certainly couldn't serve. Sylvia Croft would recognize her instantly. But Chloe knew the invisible underbelly of the hospitality industry. She knew that large catering companies always needed last-minute, off-the-books labor for dish pits and back hallway prep stations. She called a former manager, a gruff man named Leo, who owed her a favor, and begged for a back-of-house shift at the plaza, citing her mother's mounting medical bills. Leo reluctantly agreed, assigning her to the subterranean prep kitchens. The night of the gala, the plaza was a dazzling display of wealth. Upstairs, billionaires drank vintage champagne under crystal chandeliers. Downstairs, in the sweltering, fluorescent-lit bowels of the hotel, Chloe was sweating through a white chef's coat, scraping uneaten caviar off bone china plates. She had a plan, albeit a desperate one. She had spent the last of her savings bribing a young, indebted catering waiter named Thomas. At 10 p.m., Chloe slipped out of the dish pit, navigating the labyrinthine service corridors until she reached the service door just outside the Grand Ballroom's VIP powder room. She pulled a black, disposable face mask over her nose and mouth, a common enough sight for hotel staff, and waited in the shadows. A few moments later, her burner phone buzzed once in her pocket. The signal. Thomas had executed his part. Upstairs in the ballroom, Thomas had intentionally tripped, sending a full tray of sticky, dark Kir Royales crashing directly into the skirt of Sylvia Croft's silver evening gown. Less than a minute later, the heavy brass door of the powder room swung open. Sylvia Croft stormed in, her face a mask of absolute, terrifying fury, dabbing furiously at the dark purple stains ruining her silk dress. She was alone. Her security detail remained stationed in the hallway. Chloe, heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, slipped out of the service corridor and silently followed Sylvia into the opulent, marble-lined bathroom. Sylvia marched straight to the grand vanity mirrors, dropping her small, rigid metallic clutch onto the marble counter to turn on the gold faucets. She leaned over, frantically scrubbing at the silk with a wet paper towel, cursing under her breath. Chloe moved with the absolute silence she had perfected over years of serving the rich. She was a ghost. She glided behind the row of velvet seating chairs, keeping her eyes locked on the metallic clutch. Sylvia's back was turned, the sound of rushing water masking Chloe's footsteps. With trembling, gloved hands, Chloe reached out. She unclasped the clutch. It wasn't locked. Sylvia clearly assumed the powder room was secure. Inside sat a compact makeup mirror, a tube of Chanel lipstick, and nestled in the corner, a heavy, matte black titanium thumb drive. Chloe grabbed the drive. It felt terrifyingly heavy in her palm. Suddenly, Sylvia paused her scrubbing. She looked up, her cold eyes locking onto the vanity mirror. In the reflection, she saw the masked staff member, standing directly behind her open purse. "Hey!" Sylvia barked, whirling around, water dripping from her hands. Chloe didn't hesitate. She shoved the drive deep into her pocket, turned on her heel, and bolted. "Security!" Sylvia screamed, her voice echoing off the marble. Chloe burst through the heavy brass doors, startling the two men in dark suits standing in the hallway. Before they could react, she pivoted and threw herself into the service stairwell. She flew down the concrete steps, taking them 3 at a time, her breath tearing through her lungs. She heard the heavy thud of dress shoes hitting the stairs above her. They were coming. She hit the subterranean kitchen level, tearing off her chef's coat and mask as she sprinted through the chaotic maze of prep tables and shouting chefs. "Hey! Watch it!" Leo yelled as she shoved past him. Chloe burst out of the loading dock doors into the freezing New York night, disappearing into the chaotic, glittering traffic of Fifth Avenue. She didn't stop running until she was buried deep in the anonymity of the subway system, gasping for air, her hand clutching the cold titanium drive in her pocket. She had the weapon. Now she had to fire it. The digital clock in the corner of the monitor at CyberConnect, a grimy 24-hour internet cafe in Flushing, Queens, read 3:15 a.m. The room smelled of stale energy drinks, overheated processors, and the desperate sweat of insomniacs playing online games in the darkened booths. Chloe Higgins sat in the furthest corner, her back to the peeling plaster wall, the collar of her thrift store jacket pulled high around her face. Her eyes burned from sheer exhaustion, the grit of 3 sleepless nights making her vision swim. But she couldn't sleep. If she slept, Richard Hawthorne would ring the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange in exactly 6 hours and 15 minutes. Her trembling fingers hovered over the battered, sticky keyboard. Plugged into the tower beneath the desk was the matte black titanium thumb drive she had stolen from Sylvia Croft's clutch. On the screen, a minimalist, terrifyingly blank prompt blinked relentlessly. Ethelgard Secure Server. Biometric or encryption. Override required. The serial number of the very first patent we filed. Damien Cross's final, terrified words echoed in her mind. She had spent an agonizing 90 minutes on a separate terminal, navigating the Byzantine labyrinth of the United States Patent and Trademark Office's online database. Ethelgard was a ghost ship of shell companies, holding corporations and intellectual property transfers designed to obfuscate ownership. Finally, buried under a subsidiary filing from 8 years prior, she had found the foundational patent for the neural pathway binding agent that would eventually be branded as amnionix. Filing number US 8475921B2. Chloe took a breath that rattled in her chest. She typed the alphanumeric sequence into the password field and slammed the enter key. The screen froze. For 5 torturous seconds, nothing happened. The fan inside the cheap computer tower whined in protest. Chloe's heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. If she was wrong, the drive might wipe itself. Kroll Inc.'s cyber division might already be tracking the ping. Then, the prompt vanished. The screen blinked black, and a sprawling, unencrypted file directory populated the desktop. Zurich_backup_raw. Patient_outcomes_unredacted_Q3. Mortality_index_final. Croft_internal_comms. Chloe's hand shook violently as she gripped the plastic mouse and double-clicked the mortality_index_final spreadsheet. The document opened, flooding the screen with rows and columns of cold, clinical data. Chloe's eyes scanned the headers. Patient ID, dosage, onset of toxicity, date of expiration. It wasn't 12 patients anymore. The number had climbed to 24 in the last 2 weeks. The neuroregenerative compound wasn't just failing to cure dementia, it was actively liquefying the patient's livers and triggering catastrophic pulmonary embolisms. Tears, hot and acidic, spilled over Chloe's eyelashes. She scrolled frantically, searching for the one number that mattered. There it was. Row 188, patient 401. Chloe clicked on the attached clinical notes. The medical jargon was dense, but the conclusion was unmistakable, written with the sociopathic detachment of a corporate butcher. Patient 401, exhibiting end-stage hepatic failure. Violent hemorrhaging in nasal cavities. Neural degradation accelerated by 400%. Categorized as acceptable attrition. Recommend transferring to palliative care post-IPO to avoid statistical anomaly in Q4. Acceptable attrition. They knew. Hawthorne knew her mother was dying in agony, and he had categorized it as an acceptable loss on a billionaire's balance sheet. A new, terrifying emotion eclipsed her grief. It was a cold, absolute rage. Chloe closed the spreadsheet and opened the folder labeled Croft_internal_comms. Here was the smoking gun. It contained dozens of archived, encrypted emails between Sylvia Croft and Richard Hawthorne. She found the message Damien had panicked about. Sylvia confirming the intentional arson of the New Jersey server farm to destroy the physical evidence of the deaths, authorized explicitly by Hawthorne. The fire at the Secaucus data center was a success. Local fire marshals are attributing it to faulty HVAC wiring. The SEC has no physical trail. Proceed with the bell ringing. It was all here. The conspiracy, the fraud, the murders. But Chloe knew having the evidence wasn't enough. Going to the local NYPD precinct with a stolen flash drive was a death sentence. Hawthorne's legal team at Skadden, ARPS, Slate, Meaga, and Flom would tie the evidence up in chain of custody disputes for a decade. Sylvia Croft would ensure Chloe had a fatal accident long before a judge ever saw a docket. She needed a nuclear option. She needed to expose the data to entities that Hawthorne couldn't buy, and she had to do it simultaneously so he couldn't play them against each other. Chloe opened a secure, encrypted browser, utilizing the Tor network. She created a burner Proton Mail account. She began compressing the massive Ethelgard files into a single encrypted ZIP folder. The upload bar appeared. Estimated time, 14 minutes. 14 minutes felt like a lifetime. Chloe constantly checked the cafe's dirty front window, watching the empty, rain-slicked street. Every passing set of headlights made her flinch. 10 miles away, in a penthouse suite at the Mandarin Oriental, Sylvia Croft's phone vibrated on her marble nightstand. Sylvia awoke instantly, her mind sharp. She answered the call. "Croft," she snapped. "Mom, it's Gorman at Kroll Cyberops." The voice on the other end was tense. "We just received an automated beacon ping. The Zurich backup drive has been connected to an external, unsecured network." Sylvia sat bolt upright, tossing the high thread count sheets aside. She scrambled to her vanity, ripping open her metallic clutch. The interior was empty. The drive was gone. Her mind flashed back to the powder room at the plaza, the masked caterer who had run like a frightened rabbit. "Where is the ping originating from?" Sylvia demanded, her voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal register. "An internet cafe in Flushing, Queens. IP address is masking through a proxy, but the physical hardware ping gave us a 10-block radius. We are narrowing it down now." "Send a strike team," Sylvia ordered, already pulling on a pair of slacks and a trench coat. "Do not let whoever has that drive hit send. Break their fingers, break their neck. I don't care. Secure the data. Hawthorne rings the bell in 5 hours." Back in the Queen's Internet Cafe, the upload bar crawled to 89%. Chloe frantically typed out her email. She didn't address it to general tip lines. She addressed it to the specific, high-level entities who could halt a multi-billion-dollar financial event. To the director of the SEC Whistleblower Office, the FDA Office of Criminal Investigations, the investigative desk at Bloomberg News. Subject: urgent. Ethelgard Pharmaceuticals. IPO fraud. 24 patient fatalities. Message: attached is the unredacted clinical data for the Amnionix Phase 3 trials, alongside internal communications between CEO Damian Cross, Hawthorne Capital CEO Richard Hawthorne, and Director of Risk Management Sylvia Croft. The drug is lethal. They have murdered 24 people and committed arson to cover it up. Damian Cross did not commit suicide. He was preparing to blow the whistle. Richard Hawthorne is ringing the NYSE bell at 9:30 a.m. today. Stop him. The upload hit 95%. Suddenly, the roar of a heavy engine echoed down the quiet street outside. Chloe looked up. A matte black Chevrolet Suburban, entirely devoid of taxi markings or license plates, screeched to a halt directly outside the glass front of the cafe. Chloe's blood ran cold. 4 men in dark tactical windbreakers piled out of the vehicle, moving with terrifying military precision toward the front door. 98%. "Come on," Chloe whispered, her finger hovering over the mouse button. "Come on, come on." The bell above the cafe door chimed loudly. The men stepped inside, their eyes scanning the rows of glowing monitors. "Check the back booths," one of them ordered, his hand resting on a bulge beneath his jacket. 100%. Upload complete. Chloe slammed the left mouse button, hitting send. Instantly, she ripped the titanium drive from the USB port, shoved it deep into her pocket, and kicked the computer tower hard beneath the desk, severing the power cord. The monitor went black. "Hey, you in the back!" one of the Kroll operatives shouted, spotting her silhouette in the dim light. Chloe didn't look back. She vaulted over the cheap particle board desk, sprinting for the red glowing exit sign at the rear of the cafe. She hit the heavy metal fire door with her shoulder, bursting out into a narrow, garbage-filled alley, just as she heard the men charging down the aisle behind her. She scrambled over a chain-link fence, tearing her jacket and scraping her palms on the rusted metal, dropping into the neighboring alley. She ran blindly through the labyrinth of Queens side streets, not stopping until her lungs burned like fire, and the sound of pursuit had completely faded into the ambient noise of the waking city. She had done it. The files were in the wind. 4 hours later, the atmosphere on Broad Street in Lower Manhattan was electric. The facade of the New York Stock Exchange was draped in a massive celebratory banner bearing the Ethelgard Pharmaceuticals logo. News vans from CNBC, Fox Business, and Bloomberg lined the cobblestones. Inside the trading floor, the energy was at a fever pitch. Traders in their color-coded jackets shouted across the pits, eyeing the digital ticker tape that was about to display the letters ATHG. Standing on the iconic balcony overlooking the trading floor, Richard Hawthorne looked like a modern-day emperor. He wore a bespoke, midnight blue suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He stood with his hands resting confidently on the brass railing, soaking in the adulation. In exactly 10 minutes, his net worth was going to increase by $2 billion. Below him, a CNBC anchor was speaking into a camera. "We are moments away from what analysts are calling the biotech IPO of the decade. Richard Hawthorne's aggressive backing of Ethelgard's miracle dementia drug is poised to..." At 9:22 a.m., Hawthorne's private cell phone vibrated in his breast pocket. He ignored it, smiling for a photographer. It vibrated again, and again, relentlessly. Frowning, Hawthorne pulled it out. It was Sylvia. He turned slightly away from the cameras and answered. "What is it?" he hissed, I'm about to ring the bell. Richard, you need to leave the building. Sylvia's voice was completely unrecognizable. The icy, controlled operative was gone. She sounded breathless, frantic, terrified. You need to get to the helipad on the East River immediately. Hawthorne's stomach dropped. What are you talking about? The data, Sylvia choked out. The Zurich files. Someone leaked them. Bloomberg just published a special bulletin 3 minutes ago. They attached the internal emails, Richard. They know about the New Jersey fire. They know about the deaths. Hawthorne stared down at the trading floor. The chaotic shouting was beginning to change in pitch. It wasn't the roar of excitement anymore. It was the sharp, panicked cacophony of confusion. Traders were staring down at their Bloomberg terminals, their faces draining of color. "Fix it," Hawthorne demanded, his voice a guttural growl. "Call Skadden. Get an injunction." "It's too late," Sylvia screamed over the line. "The SEC just froze the ticker. The IPO is halted. Richard, the FBI field office in Manhattan just executed a raid on Ethelgard headquarters. I'm at Teterboro. I'm getting on the jet." The line went dead. Sylvia Croft was running. Hawthorne stood frozen on the balcony. He looked up at the massive digital board. Where the Ethelgard ticker was supposed to appear, there was only a flashing red banner. Trading halted. Pending regulatory investigation. Before Hawthorne could even take a step toward the VIP exit, the heavy oak doors leading to the balcony burst open. The private security guards were shoved aside as a dozen men and women wearing tactical vests, emblazoned with FBI and SEC enforcement, swarmed the platform. The flashing cameras of the press corps below went into a blinding frenzy, capturing every second of the spectacular downfall. A senior federal agent stepped directly into Hawthorne's personal space, holding up a thick stack of warrants. "Richard Hawthorne," the agent's voice boomed, carrying over the stunned silence of the trading floor. "You are under arrest for massive securities fraud, interstate conspiracy, and 24 counts of depraved heart murder. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Hawthorne's mouth opened. But for the first time in his life, the billionaire had absolutely nothing to say. The cold steel of handcuffs ratcheted around his wrists, the definitive sound of an empire collapsing. Miles away, in a quiet, sunlit room at Queen's General Hospital, the chaotic noise of Wall Street was a universe away. Chloe Higgins sat in a plastic chair beside a hospital bed. The television mounted in the corner was muted, the screen dominated by the breaking news banner. Hawthorne arrested on NYSE balcony. Ethelgard executives indicted in massive, fatal drug cover-up. Chloe wasn't watching the screen. She was looking at her mother. Evelyn lay against the pillows. Her skin still bore the terrifying, jaundiced yellow hue of hepatic failure. The toxic effects of amnionix could not be reversed. The damage to her internal organs was permanent and fatal. The doctors had given her weeks, perhaps days. But as Evelyn stirred, opening her cloudy eyes to look at her daughter, she wasn't thrashing in pain. The violent hemorrhaging had stopped. "Chloe," Evelyn rasped weakly, her hand trembling as it reached across the blanket. Chloe took her mother's frail, cool hand in both of hers, pressing it gently to her cheek. Tears streamed silently down the waitress's face, a complex mixture of profound grief and immense, overwhelming relief. "I'm here, Mom," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm right here. You don't have to take those pills anymore. You're safe." Evelyn offered a weak, confused smile, her thumb weakly brushing against Chloe's tears. Did you fix it, sweetheart?" Chloe looked up at the television, watching the footage of Richard Hawthorne being shoved into the back of a federal vehicle, his arrogant facade completely shattered. He had thought he was untouchable. He had thought the people serving him were invisible. "Yeah, Mom," Chloe whispered, resting her head on the edge of the mattress. I fixed it. They can't hurt anyone else ever again. There is a specific kind of invisibility reserved for those who serve, but it is a dangerous mistake to confuse silence with compliance. Chloe Higgins never sought to be a hero. She was simply a desperate daughter fighting for her mother's life. Yet, by leveraging the very invisibility that society forced upon her, she dismantled a multi-billion-dollar empire built on greed and human suffering. The tragic reality is that her mother's health couldn't be restored, a permanent scar left by corporate malice. However, the 19 lives saved from the continued distribution of a lethal drug stand as a testament to the devastating power of the truth. When a piece of moving furniture decides to strike back, the foundations of power inevitably crumble. It all began with a single, whispered sentence, proving that in a world of billionaires, the most dangerous weapon is someone with nothing left to lose.